Hey guys, tonight we're heading to medieval Jerusalem as Baldwin IV, the teenage crusader king whose daily routine included leprosy, assassination-level politics, religious tension, heat stroke, and occasional wars against Saladin. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You were born in Jerusalem in the year 1161, which is already a catastrophic opening move if your goal is to live peacefully past the age of 40. The Kingdom of Jerusalem is technically a Christian kingdom, but realistically, it is a heavily armed anxiety attack sitting in the middle of the Crusades. Your father, Amalric I, rules a kingdom permanently balanced between holy war and complete collapse. Every border threatens invasion. Every noble family wants power. Every knight believes he is the main character of history, and every priest is absolutely certain God supports his specific political faction. Medieval politics was essentially modern social media arguments, except everyone had horses and access to swords. As a child, though, your life initially seems promising. You are intelligent, disciplined, and unusually mature for your age. Your tutor, William of Tyre, is impressed by how quickly you learn languages, history, religion, and politics. While other boys are trying to throw figs at servants, you are discussing matters of state like a tiny, exhausted accountant trapped in a prince's body. But then something strange begins happening. One day, while roughhousing with other noble boys, they start pinching and hitting each other the way medieval children apparently entertain themselves before toys and functioning parenting. The other boys yelp in pain. You do not react. At first, nobody thinks much of it. Perhaps young Baldwin is simply brave, strong, tough, future warrior king material. Very inspiring. Then they pinch harder. Still nothing. Now the adults begin looking nervous in the deeply medieval way, where nobody says anything directly. But suddenly several priests appear in the hallway, and everyone starts whispering in Latin. William of Tyre realizes you cannot properly feel pain in your arm. Physicians are summoned immediately, which in the 12th century is roughly equivalent to hearing, "Good news. We have invited several men with dirty knives to guess what is wrong with you." The doctors inspect your skin, your nerves, your movements. They discuss symptoms using alarming religious language, while probably washing their hands approximately never. Eventually, the conclusion arrives like an executioner entering the room. Leprosy. Now today, leprosy is treatable. In medieval Jerusalem, however, it is one of the most feared diseases imaginable. People associate it with divine punishment, decay, isolation, and slow suffering. Basically, if medieval illnesses were ranked like terrifying celebrity guests, leprosy enters the room wearing a crown. And the truly cruel part is this. You are still just a child. You can still hear church bells echo across Jerusalem. Still watch knights training beneath the burning sun. Still smell bread baking in the palace kitchens. But now every adult around you quietly understands something horrifying. The future king of Jerusalem is already dying, and somehow your worst days are still ahead of you. By the time you reach your early teenage years, the kingdom of Jerusalem already feels less like a kingdom and more like a wagon rolling downhill with one wheel missing. Your father, Amalric I, spends most of his reign fighting wars, negotiating fragile alliances, and trying to stop ambitious nobles from tearing each other apart long enough to focus on the actual enemies outside the kingdom. Unfortunately, medieval nobles treated cooperation the same way cats treat bathing. Then your father dies. Just like that, at 13 years old, you become king of Jerusalem. And this is where you officially stop being a child forever. The coronation itself is magnificent. Priests chant inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Incense fills the air. Noble banners sway overhead while armoured knights stand guard beside candlelit walls. To the people watching, you look like a symbol of hope sent by God himself. Meanwhile, your body is slowly losing sensation one limb at a time. Wonderful contrast there. At first, many nobles try pretending your illness is manageable. Perhaps it will progress slowly. Perhaps God will intervene. Perhaps medieval medicine will somehow discover a treatment beyond drink questionable liquids and pray aggressively. But everyone knows the truth. A leper king creates a terrifying political problem. Because if you die young without a strong heir, the entire kingdom could collapse into civil war right when Saladin is rising to power nearby. And Saladin is not some random desert raider. He is intelligent, disciplined, patient, and dangerously competent, which is very inconvenient for Jerusalem. Still, despite your condition, you refuse to hide. You attend councils. You study politics. You ride horses. You train with weapons while your tutors and servants quietly watch for signs that your disease is worsening. Sometimes your fingers grip poorly. Sometimes your muscles weaken unexpectedly. Sometimes you injure yourself without even realizing it. Imagine trying to rule a kingdom when your own nervous system has essentially stopped sending customer support updates. Yet people begin admiring you anyway. Not because you are healthy or intimidating, but because you are determined, calm, focused. You carry yourself with dignity while many fully healthy nobles around you behave like overgrown children fighting over inheritance money. And deep down, everyone understands something unsettling. This sick teenager may genuinely be the strongest person in the kingdom. Being king of Jerusalem would already be difficult if you were healthy. Unfortunately, you are a teenage leper, ruling what is essentially the medieval world's most violently contested piece of real estate. Jerusalem is sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike, meaning nearly everyone in the region has emotional, religious, political, or military reasons to fight over it. Owning the city is less like governing a kingdom, and more like sitting on a golden chair placed directly above a volcano. To the north and south, Muslim powers circle constantly. Raids erupt along borders. Castles require endless repairs. Roads remain dangerous. Pilgrims arrive from Europe expecting holy enlightenment, and instead discover heat stroke, dysentery, and taxes. And inside your own court, things somehow become even more exhausting. The nobles of Jerusalem spend an impressive amount of time competing against one another, while the kingdom itself teeters on the edge of destruction. One faction supports this marriage alliance. Another wants different heirs. One lord insults another lord's honour. Someone storms out of a council meeting dramatically. Medieval politics often resembled a family dinner, where everyone happened to own cavalry. As king, you are expected to manage all of this calmly. You hold court beneath heavy stone arches, while servants wave away the heat with cloth fans. Petitioners complain about land disputes, stolen livestock, unpaid debts, and border attacks. Knights argue constantly about strategy, despite many of them possessing the tactical awareness of aggressive furniture. Meanwhile, your illness quietly progresses. Some mornings your joints ache terribly. Other days your hands feel strangely numb. You begin relying more heavily on attendants to help with armor and clothing. Not publicly, of course. A king must appear strong, even when his body is slowly turning against him like a mutiny conducted by nerves. Yet strangely, hardship sharpens you. You study diplomacy carefully. You learn which nobles are loyal and which smile too much. That second group is especially dangerous. In medieval courts, anyone smiling excessively was probably planning either betrayal or marriage negotiations, sometimes both. And then there is Saladin. Word spreads across the east about the brilliant Muslim leader uniting territories around Jerusalem. Unlike many rival rulers, Saladin is patient, disciplined, intelligent, and deeply respected by his men. This is terrible news, because history occasionally creates men so capable that everyone around them begins sweating nervously. And you, a teenage king with leprosy, are expected to stop him. At first, your illness moves slowly enough that people can pretend everything is normal. You still ride horses through Jerusalem's dusty streets. You still attend councils beneath flickering torchlight. You still sit at long banquet tables, while nobles loudly discuss military strategy, as if shouting automatically improves ideas. But leprosy is patient. That is what makes it terrifying. It does not usually kill quickly like plague or battlefield wounds. Instead, it slowly dismantles your body piece by piece, like a cruel craftsman carefully taking apart a machine while you are still using it. The numbness spreads through your hands first. You begin dropping objects unexpectedly. Cups slip from your fingers. Sword grips feel strange. Sometimes servants notice bruises or cuts on your skin that you never even felt happen. One physician quietly warns that without pain, injuries become invisible enemies. Imagine trying to survive the medieval world while your body's alarm system simply stops working. An absolutely dreadful design flaw. Worse still, your face begins showing signs of the disease. In medieval society, appearance matters enormously for rulers. Kings are supposed to look strong, healthy, chosen by God, preferably while sitting dramatically on horses beneath giant banners. Unfortunately, your body has other plans. Some nobles start staring at you differently now. Not openly, of course. Nobody wants to insult the king directly. That tends to shorten life expectancy considerably. But you notice the hesitation, the whispers, the subtle discomfort whenever your illness becomes visible. And yet you continue working. You attend military briefings despite exhaustion. You review fortifications, negotiate disputes, and listen to endless complaints from ambitious lords who somehow still believe their personal rivalries are the kingdom's greatest threat. Meanwhile, the actual greatest threat is gathering strength outside the borders. Saladin continues expanding his power across the region. City after city falls under his influence. His armies grow stronger, his commanders more disciplined. Even his reputation begins frightening people. The kingdom needs a warrior king. Instead, it has a teenager whose servants sometimes help him dress because his fingers no longer cooperate properly. And this is the strange part. Rather than making you weaker mentally, the disease hardens you. You stop caring about luxury. Stop wasting time trying to impress shallow courtiers. You understand something many healthy nobles never will. Life is short, fragile, and brutally unfair, which means there is no point pretending otherwise. If you are going to die young anyway, then you might as well become terrifying first. If disease were your only problem, your life might almost be manageable. Unfortunately, you also have a royal court, and medieval royal courts are essentially elegant snake pits with better clothing. As your illness becomes more visible, the nobles of Jerusalem begin quietly calculating the future. Not your future, of course. That part looks increasingly grim. They are calculating their own futures. Who inherits power? Who controls the throne after your death? Who gains influence through marriage alliances? Nothing motivates medieval aristocrats quite like the possibility of land and titles. Every council meeting now carries tension beneath the surface. Noble families whisper in shadowed corridors. Alliances form during banquets over roasted meat and wine. Men smile warmly to each other while secretly planning political destruction. It is all very civilized in the same way poisoned wine is technically still a beverage. One of the kingdom's biggest concerns is succession, because you are unlikely to produce heirs. Leprosy has already weakened your body significantly, and everyone knows the kingdom needs stability after your death. Without a clear successor, Jerusalem could collapse into civil war precisely when Saladin is becoming more powerful every year. Wonderful timing, really. Your sister, Sibylla of Jerusalem, suddenly becomes central to every political discussion. Whoever marries her could eventually control the kingdom. Naturally, this attracts ambitious men from across the Crusader states, like flies discovering exposed fruit. Some nobles support experienced military leaders. Others prefer weaker candidates they can manipulate easily. Medieval politics often worked on the principle of, I would rather destroy the kingdom than let my rival gain influence. And somehow, you must manage all this while your own health declines. During formal ceremonies, attendants sometimes help you mount horses discreetly. Your grip weakens further. Walking long distances becomes exhausting, yet you still force yourself into armour, still appear before troops, still sit through endless political arguments that could probably have been solved by locking several nobles in a room and waiting until they tired themselves out. What shocks people most is your composure. You rarely explode in anger, rarely complain publicly. Even your enemies admit you possess dignity far beyond your years. Perhaps suffering matures people quickly, or perhaps when your nerves are literally deteriorating, petty court drama simply loses some emotional impact. Lord Raymond insulted Lord Guy during dinner. Incredible. Meanwhile, your body is actively dissolving. Yet beneath your calm exterior, you understand the terrifying truth better than anyone. The kingdom is beginning to fracture, and once cracks begin spreading through Jerusalem, Saladin will not hesitate to break the whole thing apart. Most kings in your condition would probably remain inside dark chambers surrounded by priests, physicians, and optimistic people saying things like, perhaps rest will help. You do not have that luxury, because the borders of Jerusalem are constantly under threat, and your nobles still expect their king to lead. So despite worsening leprosy, you continue riding with armies across the dry hills and burning plains of the Holy Land, which is impressive enough already. Riding a horse while healthy is difficult. Riding one while parts of your body are gradually losing coordination, feels like history, personally issuing you a challenge out of spite. The heat becomes unbearable during campaigns. Armour traps sunlight against your body like a portable oven. Dust clings to your skin. Sweat burns your eyes. Long marches leave soldiers exhausted before battles even begin. Medieval warfare was far less glorious than paintings suggest. Most of it involved dehydration, disease, terrible smells, and men arguing about supplies. And through all of this, your illness keeps advancing. Your eyesight weakens slowly. Some days your vision blurs badly enough that distant figures become shapeless movements beneath banners. Your hands struggle with weapon grips. Servants increasingly help secure your armour before battles, because fastening straps alone has become difficult. Naturally, none of this improves morale. Some knights begin quietly wondering whether a dying king can truly protect Jerusalem. Others fear God is punishing the kingdom through your illness. Medieval people loved interpreting every tragedy as divine messaging. Famine? God is angry. Earthquake? God is furious. Your goat fell into a river? Also somehow God. But then something strange happens. The soldiers begin respecting you more, because unlike many nobles, you actually share their hardships. You ride beside them through brutal heat. You endure exhaustion without complaint. You continue appearing on campaign despite pain, weakness, and exhaustion that would break most people twice your age. And soldiers notice these things. One knight later recalls seeing you riding silently beneath the desert sun, your face partly covered, your weakened hands struggling slightly with the reins, yet refusing assistance. That image stays with them, not because you look powerful, but because you refuse surrender. Meanwhile, across the region, Saladin continues gathering strength. Fortresses fall under his influence. Muslim forces unify more effectively each year. His commanders grow increasingly confident. Everyone understands what is coming eventually. A massive confrontation, and deep down, many fear Jerusalem cannot survive it, especially with a king whose own body is collapsing faster than the kingdom around him. By the year 1177, the situation becomes disastrous even by Crusader standards, which is saying something because Crusader history is essentially one long sequence of catastrophes interrupted occasionally by miracles. Saladin launches a major invasion into the Kingdom of Jerusalem with a massive army. His forces sweep across the countryside, raiding settlements and advancing toward Jerusalem itself. Many believe the kingdom is finished. Honestly, they have good reasons. Saladin commands thousands of experienced troops. You, meanwhile, are a sick teenage king whose body is actively malfunctioning. Your available forces are badly outnumbered. Several nobles hesitate to commit fully. Others are busy arguing, which medieval lords continue doing with remarkable dedication, even during national emergencies. At this point, most rulers would probably retreat behind city walls and prepare for siege. Instead, you decide to attack, which sounds brave in history books, but probably sounded completely insane at the time. You ride out with a much smaller army near the hill of Montgisard. Priests carry sacred relics beside the troops, including what is believed to be a fragment of the true cross. Soldiers pray nervously while dust swirls through the air beneath the burning sun. And there you are at the centre of it all. A teenager with leprosy leading a desperate cavalry charge against one of the greatest commanders of the age. No pressure whatsoever. By now, your illness has already weakened you considerably. Mounting horses is difficult. Your body tires easily. Some accounts suggest attendants may have helped support you physically during the campaign. Yet somehow you still ride with the army as banners snap violently in the wind. Then the battle begins. The Crusader cavalry crashes into Saladin's forces with shocking speed and fury. Chaos erupts instantly. Horses scream. Metal collides. Men vanish beneath clouds of dust and blood. Medieval battles were less heroic cinematic duel, and more terrifying confusion, where everyone hopes they are stabbing the correct person. Against all expectations, Saladin's army breaks. The Muslim forces retreat in disorder, while Crusader knights pursue them across the battlefield. It becomes one of the most astonishing victories in Jerusalem's history. And suddenly the sick king everyone pitied becomes a legend. Word spreads rapidly across Christendom. Baldwin IV, the leper king, defeated Saladin himself. Imagine being one of the nobles who doubted you earlier. Very awkward conversations afterward. But the victory changes something deeper too. For the first time, people stop seeing you merely as a dying boy struggling to survive. Now they see something far more dangerous, a king who refuses to surrender even to fate itself. After the victory at Montgisard, people across Jerusalem celebrate you as a miracle king. Unfortunately, miracles do not stop leprosy. Your condition continues worsening slowly, relentlessly, day after day. And now comes one of the cruelest parts of your life: medieval medicine, which, to be fair, was less a science and more an elaborate guessing competition performed by deeply confident men. Physicians examine your skin beneath candlelight while discussing bodily humours with absolute certainty. Priests recommend prayer, fasting, holy oils and relics. Herbal remedies are mixed together in steaming bowls that smell like wet plants and despair. At various points, people probably suggest treatments involving bloodletting, because medieval doctors viewed removing blood the way modern people view charging electronics. Something wrong? Take some blood out. You endure all of it. Ointments sting your damaged skin. Bitter mixtures burn your throat. Heated instruments press against infected areas. The palace chambers where you receive treatment begin carrying a permanent smell of vinegar, herbs, oil, sweat, incense, and sickness. And beneath all of it hangs the fear, because everyone around you knows what advanced leprosy eventually does. Your hands weaken further. Your face changes gradually. Numbness spreads across your limbs. Some fingers begin curling awkwardly from nerve damage. At times you injure yourself without noticing until servants point out blood on your clothing. Imagine trying to rule a kingdom while your own body keeps sending surprise notifications saying, "Important system failure detected." Still, you continue appearing publicly whenever possible. That matters enormously. In medieval society, kingship depends heavily on image. A ruler must look strong, healthy, chosen by God. You, meanwhile, are slowly becoming the physical opposite of medieval ideals, while still somehow commanding respect through sheer determination. And the strange thing is this: your suffering almost increases your authority. The people of Jerusalem watch you endure pain, weakness, exhaustion, and humiliation without retreating from duty. Many begin viewing you as something almost sacred, not because you are healthy or beautiful, but because you continue carrying the burden anyway. Meanwhile, the court remains vicious. Certain nobles quietly maneuver for influence around your sister Sibylla of Jerusalem and potential succession plans. Some men speak loyally to your face while privately preparing for the kingdom after your death. Medieval politics always becomes more aggressive whenever someone smells weakness, rather like sharks. Except sharks are generally more honest about their intentions. And outside Jerusalem's walls, Saladin rebuilds his strength patiently. Because one defeat does not discourage a man like Saladin. It simply teaches him to prepare more carefully next time. Victory at Montgisard buys Jerusalem time, but not peace. And in medieval politics, time simply gives people more opportunities to betray each other. As your illness worsens, the question of succession becomes impossible to ignore. Everyone understands you will likely die young. The real argument now is who controls the kingdom afterward. Unfortunately, nearly every important noble has a different answer. Some support Raymond III, an experienced and intelligent noble who believes stability matters more than ambition. Others gather behind Guy of Lusignan, a French knight whose confidence greatly exceeds his competence. This is a dangerous medieval combination. History is filled with disasters caused by charismatic men who mistake self-belief for ability. Your sister Sibylla of Jerusalem marries Guy, instantly pushing him toward the centre of royal power. Some nobles approve. Others react like someone just announced the kingdom will now be managed by an enthusiastic goat. You personally begin doubting Guy fairly quickly. At first he appears respectable enough. Handsome, ambitious, noble-born. The sort of man medieval artists would probably paint heroically while leaving out all the bad decisions. But when military pressure increases, cracks start appearing. Guy hesitates under stress. He struggles politically. He lacks the calm discipline needed for survival in Jerusalem. Worse still, he seems more concerned with appearing kingly than actually being effective. And you notice all of this while your own body continues deteriorating. By now, walking long distances exhausts you. Your eyesight weakens further. Riding becomes increasingly painful and difficult. Some days attendants practically lift you into the saddle before public appearances. Yet despite your condition, you still manage state affairs more competently than many healthy nobles around you, which must have been deeply embarrassing for them. Tension inside the court becomes unbearable. Alliances shift constantly. banquets feel colder. Conversations stop when certain people enter rooms. Smiles become political weapons. Every noble household quietly prepares for the possibility of your death and the chaos that may follow. And you know it. You understand better than anyone that the kingdom is standing on thin ice over deep water. Because outside Jerusalem, Saladin continues watching patiently. He sees the divisions. He hears reports about your illness. He understands that kingdoms rarely collapse from enemy attacks alone. Usually they weaken themselves first. That realization terrifies you more than the disease itself, because leprosy may destroy your body, but pride, ambition, and stupidity could destroy Jerusalem forever. While the nobles of Jerusalem continue arguing like wealthy relatives fighting over inheritance at a funeral, Saladin does something far more dangerous. He waits. That patience is what makes him terrifying. Many rulers of the medieval world are impulsive. They chase glory, launch reckless invasions, and gamble entire armies on pride. Saladin is different. He studies weaknesses carefully. He builds alliances. He strengthens cities, trains armies, and slowly unites Muslim territories beneath his leadership. Meanwhile, Jerusalem grows weaker from the inside, and you can feel it happening. Your disease progresses steadily now. Your vision fades further. Your hands deform more noticeably. Some days you struggle even to hold objects properly. Servants quietly assist with basic tasks behind closed doors, so the court does not fully see how much strength you have lost. Public appearances become exhausting performances. You still sit on the throne in royal robes beneath golden candlelight, while nobles kneel before you. But underneath the silken ceremony, your body feels fragile, tired, unpredictable. Every movement requires concentration, yet somehow your mind remains sharp, perhaps sharper than ever. You recognize that Saladin is not merely trying to defeat Jerusalem militarily. He is waiting for the kingdom to collapse politically first. And honestly, the nobles are helping him tremendously. Raids along the borders intensify. Villages burn. Trade routes become dangerous. Refugees arrive in Jerusalem carrying stories of attacks and destruction. Tension spreads across the kingdom like cracks through glass. Then comes one of the greatest problems of all, Reynald of Châtillon. Reynald is reckless, violent, unpredictable, and deeply committed to making every diplomatic situation worse. He attacks caravans, provokes Muslim forces constantly, and behaves less like a strategic noble and more like a man personally trying to speed-run apocalypse. Even you struggle to control him, and every time Reynald launches another raid or insult, Saladin gains more justification for future war. The worst part is knowing you may not live long enough to stop what is coming. At night, Jerusalem feels strangely quiet. You hear distant footsteps echo through palace halls. Priests murmur prayers in candlelit chapels. Wind drifts through narrow stone windows carrying dust from the desert beyond the walls. And somewhere out there, Saladin prepares patiently. He knows your kingdom depends heavily on one exhausted young king holding everything together through sheer willpower. A king whose body is failing faster every year. And history has a cruel habit of attacking precisely when people become weakest. By now, ruling Jerusalem feels less like kingship and more like carrying a collapsing cathedral on your shoulders, while everyone around you argues about whose banner should hang above the entrance. Your illness has advanced severely. Walking without assistance becomes difficult. Your eyesight fades badly enough that faces blur at a distance. Your hands barely function properly anymore. Some fingers remain curled and stiff from nerve damage, while other parts of your body feel almost completely numb. And yet every morning servants still dress you in royal robes. That is one of the strangest things about monarchy. The ceremonies continue no matter how terrible reality becomes. Even while your body slowly breaks apart, attendants still adjust your crown carefully. Nobles still bow. Priests still chant blessings. And scribes still record official decrees as though the kingdom itself is eternal. It is not. You know that now more than anyone. The stress of leadership becomes unbearable at times. Every decision carries enormous consequences. One wrong alliance could fracture the kingdom. One failed military response could invite invasion. One ambitious noble could plunge Jerusalem into civil war the moment you die. And unfortunately, several nobles seem very interested in trying exactly that. You increasingly rely on trusted advisors like Raymond III, though even trusted allies come with complications. Medieval politics never allows simple friendships. Everyone has ambitions, family interests, territorial concerns, or old grudges dating back 3 generations because somebody insulted somebody else's horse. Meanwhile, your frustration with Guy of Lusignan grows stronger. You begin realizing he may not be capable of protecting the kingdom after your death. His leadership feels uncertain, hesitant. Too concerned with appearance and court approval, Jerusalem does not need a decorative king. It needs someone capable of surviving a storm already gathering at the gates. And outside those gates, Saladin continues growing stronger every year. Some nights, exhaustion overwhelms you completely. Your servants help remove heavy robes, while physicians inspect worsening symptoms beneath candlelight. The rooms smell constantly of oil, herbs, wax, and sickness now. Your muscles ache. Your skin burns in some places and feels dead in others. You are still barely in your 20s. That part feels especially cruel. Most young men your age are thinking about tournaments, marriage, adventure, or drunken mistakes involving taverns. You are trying to prevent the collapse of an entire kingdom while slowly going blind. And somehow, despite everything, you still refuse to surrender. Because if the king breaks first, then Jerusalem will not be far behind. There comes a point where your illness can no longer be hidden behind royal ceremony. That point arrives when your hands begin failing completely. At first, the weakness had been manageable. You dropped objects occasionally, struggled with weapon grips, needed assistance fastening armour, small humiliations quietly hidden behind palace doors. Now the damage becomes impossible to disguise. Your fingers curl unnaturally from nerve deterioration. Some parts of your hands feel completely numb, while others burn with strange pain. You cannot properly hold reins anymore for long periods. Signing documents becomes difficult. Even lifting cups at banquets sometimes requires concentration. Imagine being king while losing an argument against basic hand movement. And yet, somehow, you continue ruling. Servants adapt around you carefully. Trusted attendants help you dress in private before public appearances. Scribes stand nearby during councils to assist with decrees. Knights pretend not to notice when you struggle mounting horses. The court collectively performs a strange dance of respect and denial. Nobody speaks openly about how serious things have become, because acknowledging the full truth would force everyone to confront what comes next. Succession. The kingdom grows increasingly divided over the future. Some nobles support Guy of Lusignan despite your obvious doubts about him. Others rally around rival factions. Political conversations become sharper now, less polite, more desperate. You realize something horrifying. After your death, the nobles may tear Jerusalem apart faster than any invading army, and your body keeps weakening while all this unfolds. By now, travelling exhausts you severely. Your eyesight deteriorates further. Some accounts suggest you are sometimes carried on litters during campaigns, because riding long distances becomes too painful and dangerous. Still, you refuse complete isolation. You continue attending councils beneath torchlit ceilings while nobles argue around heavy wooden tables. You still review military reports, still speak with commanders, still try holding the kingdom together through sheer force of will, while your body steadily collapses beneath you. The soldiers continue admiring you for it. Many healthy nobles avoid hardship whenever possible. You, meanwhile, continue ruling while enduring suffering most people cannot even imagine. In a strange way, your illness almost becomes proof of your strength. Not physical strength, something far rarer, endurance. Meanwhile, beyond Jerusalem's walls, Saladin watches everything carefully. Reports about your worsening condition reach him constantly. He knows time favours him now, because kingdoms built around one extraordinary person become fragile when that person begins fading away. And deep down you know it too. Your greatest fear is no longer death itself. It is leaving Jerusalem unprepared for what comes after. Most people spend their 20s planning futures. You spend yours preparing for the collapse that may follow your death. By now your condition has become devastating. Your eyesight is severely limited. Walking requires assistance. Riding horses is nearly impossible without support. The disease has consumed much of your physical strength, leaving the once active warrior king trapped inside a body that no longer obeys him properly. And yet your mind remains painfully clear, which is both a blessing and a curse, because it means you fully understand how dangerous the situation has become. The kingdom of Jerusalem depends too heavily on you personally. The nobles distrust each other. Rival factions compete constantly for influence. And worst of all, you still do not trust Guy of Lusignan to lead the kingdom against Saladin. That realization terrifies you. Not because Guy is evil, necessarily. History contains far worse men. The problem is simpler and somehow more frustrating. He is weak when strength is required, hesitant when clarity is needed, the kind of man who mistakes looking confident for actually being competent. Medieval history is full of catastrophes caused by exactly this type of person. So you begin making difficult decisions. You strip Guy of authority temporarily and attempt to secure the succession more carefully. Your young nephew, Baldwin V, is crowned as co-king while you are still alive in hopes of stabilizing the future. Imagine being so worried about your kingdom that you essentially start installing backup kings while still breathing. That is where your life has arrived. The ceremonies surrounding these decisions feel heavy and mournful. Priests chant prayers beneath cathedral ceilings, while candles flicker against gold mosaics. Nobles bow formally, but beneath the ritual everyone understands the truth. The king is dying, and once you are gone, the fragile balance holding Jerusalem together may disappear with you. At night, your chambers grow quieter now. Physicians come and go carrying oils, cloths, herbs, and the increasingly hopeless expressions of medieval doctors, realizing prayer may be their only remaining treatment plan. Servants move softly through dim corridors lit by wavering torchlight. Outside the palace windows, Jerusalem sleeps uneasily beneath the desert stars. You spend long hours thinking about the future, not your own future. That part has become painfully short. You think about the kingdom instead, about churches, markets, castles, pilgrims, soldiers, children playing in narrow streets, all the ordinary lives depending on decisions made inside these stone walls, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Saladin waits patiently for the moment those walls begin cracking apart. By the final years of your reign, Jerusalem feels exhausted. The treasury strains under endless military pressure. Noble factions barely tolerate one another anymore. Border tensions increase constantly. Every conversation inside the royal court carries the feeling of something fragile nearing collapse. And at the centre of it all sits you, nearly blind, physically broken, and still somehow the most stable person in the kingdom, which is both admirable and deeply concerning. Your health has deteriorated so severely that public appearances become rare and carefully controlled. Servants help move you through palace halls. Your body, once capable of riding into battle beside crusader knights, now struggles with ordinary movement. Yet even in this condition, people still look to you for reassurance. That says less about royal authority and more about how frightening the alternatives have become. The greatest source of tension remains the question of succession. Your attempts to limit the influence of Guy of Lusignan anger many nobles while pleasing others. Alliances shift constantly now. Former friends become rivals. Men who once toasted together at feasts now watch each other like wolves across a fire. Meanwhile, Saladin continues consolidating power outside the kingdom. His forces grow larger, better organized, more disciplined. Reports arriving in Jerusalem describe cities falling under his influence, and Muslim territories uniting more effectively than ever before. For the first time in decades, the Crusader states face an enemy capable not merely of raiding borders, but of destroying them entirely. And everyone knows it. The atmosphere inside Jerusalem changes because of this fear. Markets still operate. Pilgrims still arrive. Church bells still echo across the city each morning. But beneath ordinary life sits constant anxiety. Soldiers reinforce walls more frequently. Nobles stockpile supplies. Rumours spread through taverns and courtyards. People sense something terrible approaching. You sense it too. Some nights, you are carried onto balconies overlooking the city. From there, Jerusalem glows beneath torchlight and moonlight. Stone rooftops, narrow streets, towering churches rising above the sleeping kingdom you spent your entire short life protecting. And you know you are running out of time. The cruelest part is not your suffering anymore. It is the realization that your death may unleash forces you can no longer control. Because for all its beauty and faith, Jerusalem remains a kingdom held together by fragile personalities, temporary alliances, and one dying king refusing to let everything collapse before he takes his final breath. But history rarely waits for exhausted men, even heroic ones. By the spring of 1185, your body is finally reaching its limit. You are only 24 years old. 24. Most people at that age are still making terrible decisions with excessive confidence. You, meanwhile, have spent years carrying the survival of an entire kingdom while battling one of the most horrifying diseases of the medieval world. Leprosy has consumed nearly everything now. You are almost blind. Walking is nearly impossible without assistance. Your limbs weaken constantly. Pain mixes strangely with numbness, creating a body that feels both exhausted and disconnected from itself. The physicians still attempt treatments, though by this point even they seem aware they are mostly rearranging herbs around inevitability. And yet, despite everything, you never truly surrender to despair. That is what people remember most about you. Not merely the disease, not merely the battles, but the refusal to break. Inside the palace, the atmosphere grows mournful. Priests whisper prayers through candlelit halls while servants move quietly between chambers. Nobles speak carefully now, already thinking about the dangerous future approaching after your death, because everyone understands what comes next. Without you, the fragile balance holding Jerusalem together may collapse completely. And sadly, history proves those fears correct. After your death, power struggles intensify rapidly. Guy of Lusignan eventually gains greater authority despite all your concerns. Noble divisions worsen. Strategic mistakes multiply. The unity you fought desperately to preserve begins unraveling almost immediately. Meanwhile, Saladin continues preparing patiently. Only 2 years after your death, Jerusalem's armies suffer catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Hattin. The kingdom is shattered. Soon afterward, Saladin captures Jerusalem itself. The city you spent your life protecting is lost, and somehow that may be the cruelest ending of all. But even then, your legacy survives, because historians remember something extraordinary about Baldwin IV. Despite unimaginable suffering, despite political chaos, despite knowing his own life would be painfully short, he continued ruling with courage and determination that many healthy kings never possessed. You were not supposed to survive childhood. You were not supposed to lead armies. You were not supposed to defeat Saladin at Montchezard. And yet you did all of it anyway, which is why, centuries later, people still remember the leper king, not as a tragic figure waiting helplessly for death, but as a man who stared directly at suffering, fate, disease, and collapse, and refused to kneel before any of them. A medieval king held together almost entirely by willpower, prayer, and pure stubbornness. When Vitellius first approached the throne of Rome, the empire was already exhausted. Emperors were appearing and disappearing so quickly that Roman citizens probably stopped memorizing names altogether. Who rules Rome now had become less of a political question and more of a daily weather update. Vitellius arrived during the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors, a civil war so unstable that generals across the empire kept deciding they personally deserved supreme power, which, to be fair, was how Rome usually handled succession. There was no calm constitutional process, just angry legions, dramatic speeches, and an unhealthy amount of stabbing. But Vitellius stood apart from the others in one important way. Most Roman rulers at least pretended to enjoy military discipline, administration, or public duty. Vitellius seemed primarily interested in lunch, then dinner, then the strategic planning of tomorrow's lunch. Ancient writers described him as charming, lazy, extravagant, and hopelessly devoted to excess. He loved games, luxury, performers, racing factions, and above all, food. Not normal food either. Vitellius approached banquets like a man attempting to personally bankrupt the Mediterranean economy. Even before becoming emperor, he had built a reputation for indulgence. He spent enormous sums entertaining people and surrounding himself with flatterers. Roman nobles often hosted lavish dinners to show power and sophistication, but Vitellius treated moderation as a personal insult. If another aristocrat served peacock, he wanted 2 peacocks and an entire tray of flamingo tongues beside them. Rome was an empire powered by conquest, taxation, engineering, and apparently whatever poor sailor had to locate enough exotic fish livers to satisfy imperial cravings. Yet somehow soldiers adored him, partly because Vitellius understood something many Roman elites forgot. Hungry troops preferred generous commanders over philosophical ones. A stern speech about civic virtue could not compete with free meat and overflowing wine. So Vitellius laughed with the soldiers, feasted with them, and handed out rewards freely. It was less disciplined imperial leadership, and more popular tavern owner accidentally inherits the Roman Empire. As civil war spread, his supporters proclaimed him emperor, and suddenly Rome found itself ruled by a man who viewed the imperial treasury as a sort of magical dinner purse with infinite coins inside. Unfortunately for everyone involved, including Rome's tax collectors, it did not work that way. When Vitellius finally entered Rome as emperor, the city prepared itself for triumph. Citizens lined the streets, senators forced smiles onto their exhausted faces, and priests performed sacred rituals asking the gods for stability after months of civil war. What Rome received instead was the beginning of one of the most expensive eating careers in human history. Vitellius did not arrive quietly. His entrance resembled a military parade fused with a travelling circus, and followed closely by the smell of roasted meat. Thousands of soldiers marched beside him while wagons carried luxury goods, entertainers, servants, and enough wine to tranquilize a medium-sized province. The emperor immediately began hosting banquets on a scale that shocked even wealthy Romans. This was not easy to accomplish. Rome was already a civilization where people occasionally served entire boars wearing tiny hats during dinner parties. Roman nobles treated restraint the way pirates treat maritime law, technically real but mostly decorative. Vitellius escalated things dramatically. Ancient historians claimed he spent fortunes on single meals. One infamous dish supposedly combined ingredients gathered from across the empire: livers of rare fish, pheasant brains, flamingo tongues, and eel sperm. Even Roman readers at the time probably paused and asked, "I'm sorry, whose idea was this?" The meal was reportedly called the Shield of Minerva, because when faced with a horrifying mountain of seafood organs, naturally the solution is to give it a patriotic name. Entire kitchens worked day and night to satisfy the emperor's appetite. Ships arrived constantly carrying delicacies from distant provinces. If a fisherman in Egypt caught an unusual creature, there was a reasonable chance someone in Rome would eventually put sauce on it and carry it toward Vitellius with trembling hands. Meanwhile, ordinary Romans watched carefully. At first, many people enjoyed the spectacle. Free games were organized, crowds received food distributions, taverns stayed busy, Rome loved entertainment, and Vitellius governed like a man permanently trying to keep a party alive after everyone else wanted to go home. But beneath the laughter, problems were growing. The treasury had already been weakened by civil war. Armies needed payment. Roads needed repair. Grain still had to reach the capital. Yet enormous amounts of money vanished into banquets, celebrations, and rewards for loyal supporters. Vitellius behaved less like a cautious emperor rebuilding a wounded empire, and more like a wealthy uncle who had accidentally gained access to the imperial credit card. Unfortunately, Rome did not have a bankruptcy office. It had assassins. For Vitellius, food was not simply pleasure. It was theatre, performance, a declaration of power so excessive that every dinner became a kind of edible intimidation ritual. Roman emperors were expected to display wealth publicly. A modest ruler could appear weak, even vulnerable. But Vitellius pushed beyond luxury into something closer to competitive gluttony. He organized multiple banquets in a single day, sometimes moving from palace to palace like a determined predator hunting stuffed olives. According to ancient writers, he occasionally ate 4 massive meals daily: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and what historians politely described as another feast afterward, because apparently the concept of stopping had never fully introduced itself to him. Each gathering became more absurd than the last. Guests entered halls filled with silver plates, imported spices, fountains of wine, musicians, dancers, and servants sprinting through corridors carrying trays heavy enough to qualify as siege equipment. Entire exotic animals appeared roasted and decorated with herbs. Fish from distant seas arrived packed in ice. Rare birds disappeared into sauces so complicated that half the cooks probably had no idea what they were making anymore. Some nobles admired the extravagance. Others attended because refusing an emperor's invitation was an excellent way to shorten your lifespan dramatically. Meanwhile, senators quietly watched Rome's finances dissolve into gravy. The emperor's kitchens consumed staggering amounts of money. Vitellius reportedly bankrupted estates, emptied storehouses, and burdened local officials with endless demands for delicacies. Governors across the empire likely woke each morning praying not to receive another imperial request for slightly more unusual oysters. And yet Vitellius himself seemed almost cheerful through it all. He laughed loudly, gambled heavily, drank generously. Ancient historians describe him as approachable and humorous, especially compared to crueler emperors like Caligula or Nero. Vitellius was not obsessed with terror or philosophy. He simply behaved like a man who genuinely believed history's highest achievement was discovering new ways to combine meat with wine. But outside the banquet halls, Rome was deteriorating. Civil war had damaged trust across the empire. Rival generals still held armies. Grain supplies remained unstable, the streets filled with tension and rumours. While Vitellius sampled rare seafood somewhere inside the palace, political enemies gathered strength in the provinces. Most dangerously of all, another claimant to the throne had begun marching toward Rome. Vespasian was everything Vitellius was not. Disciplined, practical, experienced, and backed by hardened eastern legions. Rome now faced a terrifying possibility. Its emperor was feasting while a civil war approached the city gates. As Vitellius continued feasting through the summer, the mood inside Rome slowly began to change. The laughter around the banquets became thinner. The applause sounded more nervous. Senators smiled the way hostages smile in paintings, because beyond the palace walls, the empire was sliding toward another civil war. News spread that eastern legions had declared support for Vespasian, a hardened commander fighting in Judea. Unlike Vitellius, Vespasian had built his reputation through discipline, military success, and practical leadership. He was not glamorous. He was not charming. But exhausted Romans were beginning to miss the comforting idea of an emperor who occasionally thought about matters other than source selection. Vitellius, however, refused to behave like a frightened ruler. He continued hosting games, spectacles, and enormous banquets while trying to project confidence. To his supporters, this made him seem fearless. To everyone else, it resembled a man ignoring smoke while casually pouring olive oil near the fire. The streets of Rome grew tense. Fights broke out between rival political factions. Soldiers loyal to Vitellius roamed the city aggressively, extorting civilians and bullying senators. Markets became unstable. Rumours spread daily. Some claimed Vespasian's forces were unstoppable. Others whispered that Vitellius planned even larger celebrations to boost morale, which was a very elegant Roman way of saying, the emperor is stress-eating publicly. Meanwhile, the imperial court became increasingly chaotic. Vitellius surrounded himself with flatterers, gamblers, entertainers, and opportunists eager to profit, while the treasury still had coins left inside it. Honest advisers struggled to reach him. Anyone suggesting moderation probably disappeared beneath a mountain of peacock feathers before finishing the sentence. Ancient historians were ruthless in describing this period. They portrayed the emperor as lazy, indulgent, and hopelessly disconnected from reality. Some accounts were certainly exaggerated. Roman writers loved dramatic moral lessons almost as much as Romans loved wine. But even allowing for bias, the situation looked catastrophic. Then came the real panic. Vespasian's supporters began advancing toward Italy itself. Suddenly, Rome realized its emperor might actually have to lead during a military crisis. This was deeply unfortunate, because Vitellius had spent most of his reign preparing for battle the same way a sleepy housecat prepares for taxes. As enemy forces approached, desperate meetings filled the palace. Some urged negotiation, others demanded resistance. Vitellius hesitated constantly, changing decisions, avoiding responsibility, and clinging to comfort while events spiraled beyond control. And somewhere in the middle of all this political collapse, the imperial kitchens were apparently still operating at full speed. Because if civilization is crumbling, one must at least crumble with seasoned pheasant. By the time Vitellius finally understood the seriousness of the crisis, events were already racing beyond his control. The armies loyal to Vespasian were advancing steadily toward Italy, crushing resistance and gathering momentum with every victory. Rome now faced a familiar problem: another civil war. The empire had become trapped in a brutal cycle where generals with loyal armies kept deciding they should be emperor, which unfortunately was often a very convincing argument when supported by 40,000 armed men. Vitellius attempted to respond, But leadership did not come naturally to him. Feasting came naturally. Public spectacle came naturally. Ordering another tray of imported shellfish, while the treasury screamed softly in the distance, came very naturally. Military strategy, however, was less comfortable terrain. Still, preparations for war began. Barricades appeared in parts of Rome. Loyal soldiers gathered around the emperor. Weapons were distributed to civilians and gladiators alike. Yes, gladiators. Because when your government is collapsing, clearly the solution is to hand swords to professional arena fighters, already accustomed to solving problems through dramatic violence. The city descended into fear. Markets closed early. Wealthy families hid valuables or fled entirely. Rumours spread faster than official announcements. Some citizens supported Vitellius. Others secretly hoped Vespasian would arrive quickly and restore order before Rome tore itself apart completely. Inside the palace, Vitellius wavered constantly. At one point, he reportedly considered abdication. Negotiations were discussed. Supporters begged him to fight on. Others encouraged surrender. Ancient historians describe scenes of confusion, emotional speeches, and panicked advisors rushing through corridors, while the emperor drifted between despair and denial. And yet, even during this chaos, the banquets did not fully stop. This detail horrified Roman writers for generations. To them, Vitellius symbolized a ruler consumed by appetite, while the empire bled around him. Whether every story was true mattered less than what he represented. Excess without discipline. Luxury without restraint. A man trying to out-eat reality itself. Then the violence finally arrived. Forces loyal to Vespasian entered Rome after fierce fighting. Streets filled with smoke, panic, and bloodshed. Soldiers battled through neighborhoods, while terrified civilians hid indoors, listening to screams echo through the capital of the empire. Vitellius's supporters collapsed rapidly. Some abandoned him immediately. Others fought desperately. Temples and public buildings became battlegrounds. Rome, supposedly the eternal heart of civilization, now looked like a city tearing itself apart over which exhausted middle-aged man deserved the fancy chair. As defeat became unavoidable, Vitellius tried to hide. Unfortunately, hiding is difficult when you are one of the most recognizable men in the Roman world, and have spent months eating like a victorious harvest festival given human form. As Rome burned with civil war around him, Vitellius finally abandoned the illusion that he could still control events. The armies of Vespasian had broken into the city. His supporters were collapsing. The streets echoed with fighting, screams, and the unmistakable sound of Roman political transition. Heavily armed men kicking doors open. For a brief moment, Vitellius considered escaping entirely. Ancient historians claimed he attempted to flee the palace disguised in ordinary clothing, accompanied by only a few servants. Imagine the former emperor of Rome sneaking through corridors while trying not to be recognized by people who had spent months watching him host banquets large enough to alter regional food supplies. It did not go well. At first, he wandered through nearly abandoned sections of the imperial palace in confusion and fear. Many servants had already fled. Others hid silently. The vast halls that once overflowed with musicians, dancers, perfumes, and silver platters now stood eerily empty. Rome's great feast had ended. Only smoke remained. Then Vitellius made one of history's saddest imperial decisions. He hid beneath a staircase. According to Roman writers, the emperor concealed himself in the palace porter's lodge, trembling beside a dog tied near the entrance. It was a humiliating image, and historians loved repeating it because Romans deeply enjoyed moral symbolism. Yesterday's emperor had dined beneath golden ceilings. Today he crouched under stairs, hoping nobody noticed him. The contrast practically wrote itself. But hiding could only delay the inevitable. Soldiers loyal to Vespasian eventually discovered him. Ancient accounts describe Vitellius being dragged from his hiding place, half-dressed and terrified. Crowds gathered quickly. Some mocked him. Others watched silently. A few may even have pitied him. Rome had seen cruel emperors before, but Vitellius inspired something stranger. Frustration mixed with disbelief. How had the ruler of the empire allowed himself to become this? The soldiers tied his hands and dragged him through the streets toward the forum. Insults rained down from the crowd. People shouted about his gluttony, his weakness, his wastefulness. The same city that once applauded his games and feasts now treated him like a public embarrassment. Roman politics had always been brutally theatrical. Victorious generals marched enemies through the streets in chains. Failed emperors were humiliated publicly to prove that fortune could vanish overnight. One year, you were dining on flamingo tongues from silver plates. The next, strangers throw garbage at you while discussing your poor management skills. And Vitellius still had one final horror waiting for him. The final moments of Vitellius were as ugly and chaotic as his reign itself. Dragged through the streets by soldiers loyal to Vespasian, the former emperor stumbled through a Rome that no longer feared him. Crowds gathered along the roads to watch the spectacle. Some screamed insults. Others laughed openly. A few threw filth at him as he passed. Roman crowds could be wonderfully loyal right until the exact second they were not. Ancient historians claimed Vitellius was forced into the forum, while nearly naked, his clothes torn and his face bruised. A rope had reportedly been tied around his neck, and soldiers kept jerking him forward whenever he slowed. The humiliation was deliberate. Rome wanted to see the mighty reduced to helplessness. It reassured everyone that no emperor, no matter how powerful, stood above fate, especially emperors who spent the treasury trying to discover new ways to cook seafood. As Vitellius was dragged along, soldiers mocked his appearance and appetite. Some accounts say they forced him to look at the destruction caused by the civil war, before continuing toward the Gemonian stairs, a grim execution site near the Roman Forum, where disgraced criminals and political enemies often met terrible ends. The place had a dreadful reputation. Bodies left there served as public warnings. Rome did not simply remove defeated rulers. It displayed them like cautionary tales with sandals. Vitellius reportedly begged for mercy at points during the march. Ancient writers, who already disliked him, described him as cowardly and broken. Some historians may have exaggerated these scenes to make him appear weaker, but the fear itself was certainly real. The emperor, who once commanded armies and endless banquets, now faced an angry mob with nowhere left to run. Then came the execution. Sources differ on the exact details, but Vitellius was ultimately beaten and killed by the soldiers. His body was mutilated afterward and dragged through the streets before finally being thrown into the Tiber River. And just like that, the reign of Rome's great feasting emperor ended not in luxury, but in mud, blood, and public hatred. It had lasted only a few months. The irony was impossible for Roman historians to ignore. Vitellius had consumed enormous wealth trying to enjoy life at its fullest, yet he died stripped of dignity, abandoned by allies, and despised by the same crowds he once entertained. Rome had devoured him almost as completely as he had devoured Rome's kitchens. And now, with Vitellius dead, a new dynasty prepared to rise from the wreckage of civil war. After Vitellius died, the surviving rulers of Rome faced an important task: explaining why everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. Fortunately for them, Vitellius made an extremely convenient villain. The new emperor, Vespasian, quickly restored stability and founded the Flavian dynasty. Rome desperately wanted peace after the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors. And when societies recover from disaster, they often search for one person to blame entirely, someone who can carry the full weight of collective embarrassment, like a political sacrificial goat. Vitellius became that goat. Roman historians, such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, painted him as the ultimate symbol of greed, weakness, and gluttony. Their accounts described endless feasting, monstrous appetite, laziness, cowardice, and vulgar extravagance. Reading their work, one gets the impression that Vitellius personally consumed half the empire between breakfast and noon. Now, to be fair, he absolutely did indulge excessively. But Roman historians also loved moral storytelling. They did not simply record events. They crafted lessons. In their version of history, good emperors displayed discipline and moderation. Bad emperors drowned themselves in luxury and appetite until the gods punished them accordingly. Vitellius fit perfectly into that formula. So every banquet became larger in the retelling, every meal more grotesque, every floor more dramatic. Ancient writers described impossible dishes, endless vomiting to continue eating, and absurd spending habits that may have been exaggerated over time. Romans enjoyed gossip almost professionally. Add politics to the mix, and historical accuracy occasionally got thrown into the Tiber alongside the bodies. Still, even behind the exaggerations, a real truth remained. Vitellius represented a Rome that had lost control of itself. The empire had become so rich, so vast, and so politically unstable that a man could rise to supreme power largely by pleasing soldiers and throwing extravagant feasts. Civil wars shattered institutions. Armies decided emperors. Public entertainment distracted the masses while deeper problems spread beneath the surface like cracks in marble. Vitellius was not the disease. He was a symptom wearing expensive robes and holding a roasted pheasant. And yet, strangely, there is something almost tragic about him. Unlike emperors remembered for calculated cruelty, Vitellius often seems more foolish than evil, weak rather than monstrous, a man hopelessly consumed by comfort while history collapsed around him, which, unfortunately, remains one of civilization's most recurring hobbies. Today, Vitellius survives in history as one of Rome's great cautionary tales, not because he conquered vast territories or passed brilliant reforms, not because he reshaped the empire or inspired generations, but because he ate endlessly. To later Romans, Vitellius became the perfect example of imperial excess, a ruler consumed by appetite, while the empire spiraled into violence around him. His reign lasted less than a year, yet historians remembered him for centuries because he symbolized something deeply Roman, the fear that luxury could destroy power from within. Rome admired wealth, but it also distrusted it. A strong Roman leader was supposed to appear disciplined, restrained, hardened by duty. Even emperors who secretly indulged themselves usually pretended otherwise. Vitellius did not pretend very much at all. He openly embraced pleasure, spectacle, and extravagant living with the enthusiasm of a man who believed moderation was invented by unhappy people. And in calmer times, perhaps he might have survived longer. That is the strange part. Vitellius ruled during one of the worst political crises in Roman history. Civil war had shattered trust across the empire. Armies fought each other openly. Emperors rose and fell within months. The treasury was exhausted. Provinces were unstable. Rome needed discipline, strategy, and careful leadership. Instead, it got banquets featuring flamingo tongues. Historians would spend generations mocking him for that contrast. Yet despite everything, Vitellius remains oddly human compared to some Roman rulers. He was not remembered as a terrifying madman like Caligula, nor as a calculating tyrant like Domitian. He often appears less like a monster and more like a deeply flawed man completely overwhelmed by power, comfort, and circumstance. A man who mistook temporary pleasure for stability. His downfall also revealed the brutal truth of Roman politics. The empire did not reward kindness, humour, or generosity for long. It rewarded control, military loyalty, fear, administrative competence. An emperor could host magnificent games and feed thousands of people, but if rival legions marched on Rome, none of those banquets truly mattered. In the end, Vitellius discovered the same lesson many rulers learn too late. Power is never permanent. One day you recline beneath golden ceilings, while servants carry silver trays toward your couch. Musicians play softly. Wine spills into crystal cups. The richest foods in the known world arrive before you in endless waves. And the next day, Rome drags you through the streets and throws your body into the river. The empire had feasted too, and it was always hungry for more. When people think of King Arthur, they usually imagine glittering armour, noble knights, giant castles, and long speeches about honour delivered by men with remarkably clean teeth for the Middle Ages. The Britain that may have inspired the Arthur legend looked absolutely nothing like that. This was not a land of polished stone castles and organised kingdoms. It was a collapsing frontier at the edge of a dying world. Roman roads cracked apart beneath weeds. Towns emptied slowly. Old bathhouses stood abandoned like the skeletons of a vanished civilization. And across the countryside, frightened communities waited nervously for the next raid, because Rome was leaving. For nearly 4 centuries, the Roman Empire had ruled Britain. Roman soldiers guarded the frontiers. Roman engineers built roads, forts, villas, and cities. Trade connected Britain to Europe, North Africa, and beyond. Even distant provincial towns could still feel connected to the machinery of the empire. Then, during the early 5th century, the Roman world began tearing itself apart. Barbarian invasions, civil wars, economic collapse, and political chaos forced Rome to withdraw its legions from Britain. The empire basically looked at the island and said, "Best of luck with all that. before sprinting away to deal with several other disasters simultaneously. And suddenly, Britain stood alone. Without Roman protection, the island fractured into dozens of competing territories ruled by local warlords and Romano-British nobles. Some still tried to preserve Roman traditions. Others adapted quickly to the harsher new reality. Law and order weakened. Trade collapsed in many regions. Entire towns shrank or disappeared entirely. Meanwhile, enemies circled from every direction. Picts raided from the north. Irish raiders struck western coasts. And across the North Sea came growing waves of Saxon settlers and warriors who slowly carved out territories for themselves. These migrations and invasions transformed Britain permanently. Villages burned. Alliances shifted constantly. One season's ally could easily become next season's corpse in a muddy ditch. This was the world where the Arthur legend may have begun. Not a shining kingdom, but a desperate age of survival. Historians believe that if a real Arthur existed, he likely was not a king at all. He may have been a Romano-British military leader fighting against Saxon expansion sometime during the late 5th or early 6th century. Perhaps a successful warlord whose victories became exaggerated over generations until history and myth fused together completely. And honestly, that transformation makes perfect sense. When people live through chaos, they create heroes, especially when the real world offers very few. The biggest problem with proving whether King Arthur was real is painfully simple. Almost nobody wrote anything down, and the few people who did were living through such chaos that accurate record-keeping was probably not their highest priority. It is difficult to preserve neat historical archives when your village might be raided next Thursday by angry men carrying axes. The period after Rome abandoned Britain is often called the Dark Ages, partly because historians have so little reliable information from it. Written sources became rare, literacy declined in many areas, monasteries survived in some regions, but large-scale Roman administration had collapsed. Britain fragmented into isolated kingdoms, where survival mattered more than careful documentation. As a result, the historical Arthur problem becomes a giant foggy swamp of half-missing clues. The earliest surviving source often connected to Arthur comes from a monk named Gildas, writing sometime during the 6th century. Gildas described wars between the Britons and Saxons and mentioned a major British victory at the Battle of Badon, a battle many later writers connected to Arthur. But there is one enormous issue. Gildas never mentions Arthur by name, which feels like a strange omission if Arthur truly was the legendary saviour of Britain. Imagine writing about the Second World War and casually forgetting to mention Winston Churchill. Historians have spent centuries staring at this silence like detectives examining an empty chair. Later sources become even more frustrating. Around the 9th century, a writer named Nennius finally mentioned Arthur directly in a work called the Historia Brittonum. Nennius described Arthur not as a king, but as a military leader who fought 12 battles against the Saxons, winning great victories, including the famous Battle of Badon. Now things started sounding more familiar. A heroic war leader defending Britain, victorious battles, growing legend. The problem was timing. Nennius wrote about Arthur roughly 300 years after Arthur supposedly lived. That is a massive historical gap. By that point, stories had likely passed through generations of oral tradition, exaggeration, political propaganda, and the medieval equivalent of, "My cousin totally saw this happen." And yet the Arthur stories kept growing. Welsh poems, chronicles, and legends slowly transformed Arthur into something larger than life. He fought monsters, led mighty warriors, and became connected to magical figures like Merlin. The deeper historians dig into the sources, the stranger the trail becomes. Because somewhere beneath the fantasy, there may still be a real man hidden underneath centuries of storytelling. Or there may simply be several men stitched together into one immortal legend. If there is one event most closely tied to the possible historical King Arthur, it is the mysterious Battle of Badon. And naturally, historians are not entirely sure where it happened, when it happened, or who actually fought there, which is honestly very fitting for Arthurian history. Still, despite the uncertainty, Badon appears again and again in early sources as a massive victory for the Britons against invading Saxons. According to later tradition, this battle temporarily stopped Saxon expansion and gave Britain a brief period of peace after years of warfare. For people living through the chaos of post-Roman Britain, that kind of victory would have felt almost miraculous. The earliest reference comes once again from Gildas, writing in the 6th century. Gildas described Baden as a great British triumph that occurred around the time of his birth. He never named Arthur, but later writers clearly believed Arthur was the hero behind the victory, and honestly, one can understand why. Victories create legends very quickly, especially during desperate times. If one war leader managed to unite scattered British forces and defeat Saxon armies decisively, people would remember him for generations. Songs would spread, stories would grow. Details would become larger with every retelling besides smoky fires in half-ruined halls while rain hammered the roof overhead. Because Britain during this era was deeply unstable. The Roman system had collapsed. Kingdoms fought constantly. Communities lived under permanent threat of raids and invasion. In such conditions, a successful military commander would not simply become respected. He would become mythologized almost immediately. Later writers expanded the story dramatically. Nennius claimed Arthur fought 12 battles across Britain and personally killed hundreds of enemies at Baden. Medieval chroniclers later added even more heroic details. Soon, Arthur was no longer just a warrior. He became the defender of Britain itself, standing against chaos and foreign invasion, like some exhausted Romano-British version of destiny. Of course, historians remain cautious. There is no direct archaeological proof linking Arthur to Baden. Some scholars believe the battle was real, but the leader later called Arthur may have had a completely different name. Others think several war leaders were combined over time into one legendary figure. A few even argue Arthur was entirely fictional from the beginning. But the strange thing is this: the legend had to come from somewhere. People do not usually invent enormous national heroes completely out of thin air, especially during violent periods where survival dominates daily life. Something happened in Britain after Rome fell. Someone led armies. Someone won victories important enough to echo for centuries. The real Arthur, if he existed, may simply be buried beneath the legend bearing his name. By the time medieval writers truly embraced the legend of King Arthur, the story had evolved far beyond a possible Romano-British war leader fighting Saxons in muddy hills. Now Arthur had a kingdom, a glorious court, legendary knights, a magical sword, and eventually a wizard who apparently decided that the best use of supernatural power was managing medieval British politics, which already sounds exhausting enough without magic involved. This transformation accelerated during the 12th century, thanks largely to a writer named Geoffrey of Monmouth. Geoffrey wrote the Historia Regum Britannia, the history of the kings of Britain, and it completely reshaped Arthur forever. The book was wildly influential. It was also probably about as historically reliable as a tavern story told by a man named One-Eyed Gareth after 6 cups of ale. Geoffrey presented Arthur as a mighty king who ruled Britain, defeated enemies across Europe, and established a magnificent royal court. He introduced famous elements that became central to Arthurian legend, including characters like Merlin. Suddenly, the rough post-Roman warlord of earlier traditions transformed into a grand medieval monarch. And medieval Europe absolutely loved it. This was the age of knights, castles, courtly romance, and Christian kingship. Geoffrey's Arthur perfectly matched what medieval audiences wanted. A noble ruler surrounded by heroic warriors defending civilization against chaos. The fact that the real 5th century Britain contained very few giant stone castles and considerably more mud did not slow the legend down at all. Soon, other writers expanded the myth even further. French poets introduced the Round Table, noble chivalry, and romantic quests. The story of Camelot emerged as Arthur's ideal court, a place of justice, honour, and legendary fellowship. Knights such as Lancelot, Gawain, and Galahad became heroes in their own right. And then came the Holy Grail. At this point, the legend had fully escaped history and entered mythology completely. Arthurian stories became a giant medieval shared universe involving betrayal, forbidden love, Christian symbolism, magical objects, tragic destiny, and an alarming number of emotionally complicated knights. Yet despite all the fantasy, traces of the older Britain still remained hidden underneath. The wars, the collapsing kingdoms, the desperate need for unity. Camelot may never have existed physically, but psychologically it represented something very real, a dream of order in a violent world. Especially for people who rarely experienced either. For centuries, Historians and archaeologists have searched for evidence of King Arthur across Britain, and Britain, in response, has mostly offered mysterious ruins, confusing clues, and an endless supply of hills locals insist are definitely connected to Arthur somehow. There is perhaps no historical figure more aggressively attached to random locations than Arthur. Ancient forts, ruined castles, strange stones, caves, lakes, and lonely hillsides across Britain have all been linked to him at one point or another. If a pile of old rocks survives longer than 2 centuries in Britain, there is a reasonable chance someone eventually points at it and says, "Arthur slept there." Still, some sites genuinely intrigue historians. One of the most famous is Tintagel Castle in Cornwall, long associated with Arthur's legendary birthplace. Medieval writers claimed Arthur was conceived there after magical deception involving Merlin, because apparently medieval storytelling believed family drama should always include sorcery whenever possible. For years, many scholars dismissed Tintagel as pure legend. Then archaeology complicated things. Excavations revealed that Tintagel was actually an important high-status settlement during the 5th and 6th centuries, exactly the rough period connected to Arthurian traditions. Imported pottery and luxury goods from the Mediterranean were discovered there, showing that elite rulers still operated in parts of Britain even after Rome collapsed. This surprised many people who imagined post-Roman Britain as nothing but abandoned huts and sheep, wandering through societal despair. Other locations have also fueled speculation. Sites like Cadbury Castle in Somerset, sometimes connected to Camelot, show evidence of major occupation during the same era. Massive hill forts were reused and strengthened after Rome's withdrawal. Local rulers clearly defended territories and organised armies during this violent period. In other words, the historical environment for an Arthur-like figure absolutely existed. Britain really did contain powerful warlords fighting for survival after Rome fell. That much is certain. But evidence for Arthur himself remains frustratingly slippery. No inscription saying Arthur was here, no royal tomb clearly tied to the legend, no surviving documents from his supposed lifetime identifying a great king uniting Britain. Historians instead work with fragments, probabilities, and educated guesses layered beneath centuries of mythology. And then things become even stranger. In the 12th century, monks at Glastonbury Abbey claimed they had discovered Arthur's grave. Conveniently, this happened after a devastating fire when the abbey desperately needed pilgrims and donations. What followed was either a miraculous historical discovery or one of medieval Europe's most successful tourist marketing campaigns. In the year 1191, monks at Glastonbury Abbey announced something extraordinary. They had found the grave of King Arthur. Naturally, this raised several important questions. First, how convenient. Second, are we absolutely sure these monks were not just medieval businessmen wearing robes? At the time, Glastonbury Abbey desperately needed money. A disastrous fire had damaged much of the monastery, and rebuilding required enormous funds. Pilgrims meant donations. Donations meant survival, and few attractions in medieval Britain could compete with the words, "Come visit King Arthur's tomb." According to the monks, workers digging between 2 ancient stone pyramids uncovered a massive grave containing 2 skeletons and a lead cross inscribed with words identifying Arthur and his queen, Guinevere. The timing was spectacular. Too spectacular, many historians believe. Still, medieval Europe exploded with excitement. Pilgrims flocked to Glastonbury. Arthur's legend grew even larger. The supposed discovery seemed to confirm that the great king had truly existed and had finally been found resting beneath English soil. There was just one problem. The evidence was deeply suspicious. Modern historians doubt almost every part of the story. The original gravesite was poorly documented. The famous lead cross disappeared centuries ago. The inscription itself looked suspiciously convenient, almost like something written specifically to impress 12th century audiences already obsessed with Arthurian legend, which, to be fair, is exactly what scammers throughout history have consistently done. Even more interestingly, some scholars think the English monarchy actually benefited politically from Arthur's discovery. Why? Because Welsh traditions often claimed Arthur would someday return to drive out foreign rulers and restore Britain. This idea made Norman kings slightly uncomfortable, since ruling a conquered population becomes harder when local legends insist a heroic warrior king may rise from the dead eventually. So discovering Arthur conveniently dead and buried solved that problem rather neatly. Very considerate of him, really. Yet despite the likely fraud, the Glastonbury story reveals something important about Arthur's power as a legend. People wanted him to be real, deeply. For medieval Britain, Arthur represented lost greatness, unity, justice, and resistance against chaos. He became a symbol large enough for different generations to reshape according to their own fears and desires. Warriors admired him, monks Christianized him, kings used him politically, poets romanticized him, and ordinary people kept telling stories about him around fires for centuries. Because whether Arthur existed or not almost became secondary. The legend itself had become real. More real in some ways than the broken historical fragments that originally inspired it. One reason historians struggle to identify King Arthur is because the real Arthur, if he existed at all, may not actually have been named Arthur. That possibility makes this entire mystery dramatically more annoying. Several historians believe the legend could be based on one historical figure, while others argue Arthur was likely a blend of multiple war leaders whose stories fused together over generations. In a violent age with poor records and endless warfare, heroic deeds could easily migrate from one man to another until a single larger-than-life figure emerged from the confusion. And honestly, humans do this constantly. We simplify messy history into memorable stories because a complicated collection of regional military leaders resisting migration patterns during late antiquity is not nearly as exciting as mighty king with magical sword. Over the years, scholars have proposed several candidates who may have inspired the Arthur legend. One possibility is Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Romano-British leader mentioned by Gildas. Gildas described him as a noble survivor of the Saxon invasions who rallied the Britons during desperate times. He fought successfully against Saxon forces and became associated with Britain's resistance. That sounds extremely Arthur-like already. Another candidate is a warrior called Artorius, possibly connected to Roman military traditions. Some scholars believe the name Arthur itself may derive from Roman origins rather than native British ones. Others point toward Celtic war leaders whose names and achievements gradually evolved into legend through oral storytelling. Then there are the more unusual theories. Some writers have linked Arthur to ancient cavalry commanders stationed in Britain during late Roman rule. Others suggest connections to northern British kings, Welsh heroes, or even mythological figures from older Celtic traditions. At a certain point, the theories become so numerous that Arthur starts resembling a historical magnet, attracting every mysterious warrior within 500 miles. But one detail continues to matter. The timing fits. Britain during the late 5th and early 6th centuries truly was a brutal frontier society under enormous pressure. Saxon migrations were expanding. Romano-British kingdoms fought desperately to survive. Leaders capable of winning victories would absolutely have become legendary figures among frightened populations. And oral cultures preserve heroes powerfully. Stories passed from generation to generation rarely stay historically accurate, but they often preserve emotional truths. The names change, details grow exaggerated, battles become larger, heroes become nobler. Yet somewhere underneath the myth, there is often a memory of something real. Perhaps that is exactly what Arthur became. Not one man, but the memory of Britain fighting not to disappear. A symbol forged from war, loss, survival, and centuries of storytelling layered together until separating fact from legend became nearly impossible. Most historical figures eventually fade into dusty textbooks and mildly depressing museum gift shops. King Arthur did the exact opposite. For over 1,000 years, the Arthur legend has survived wars, invasions, collapsing kingdoms, changing religions, industrialization, modern skepticism, and several extremely questionable film adaptations. Somehow, the story keeps returning generation after generation, like an immortal ghost carrying a sword and unresolved emotional issues. And there is a reason for that. Arthur is not just a historical mystery. He is a perfect myth. At the centre of the legend sits a deeply powerful idea. A broken land waiting for a just ruler to restore order. That theme works in almost every century because most centuries are, unfortunately, at least partially on fire. Arthur's Britain is always standing at the edge of collapse. Enemies gather, trust weakens, kingdoms divide, and then appears a leader who promises unity, courage, and hope. People desperately want to believe such figures exist, especially during unstable times. That emotional power kept the legend alive long after the real historical context disappeared. During the Middle Ages, kings across Britain and Europe connected themselves to Arthur to strengthen legitimacy. Nobles claimed descent from him. Castles displayed Arthurian imagery. Writers expanded the legend constantly, adding romance, tragedy, magic, and Christian symbolism. The story adapted beautifully to every new era. Medieval knights saw Arthur as the ideal king of chivalry. Victorian Britain transformed him into a symbol of noble morality and imperial destiny. Modern audiences often treat him as a tragic hero doomed by betrayal and human weakness. Even the famous sword Excalibur carries symbolic weight far beyond simple fantasy. It represents rightful leadership, destiny, and the dangerous burden of power. Meanwhile, figures like Merlin, Lancelot, and Guinevere embody temptation, loyalty, wisdom, ambition, and betrayal in endlessly reusable forms. That flexibility makes Arthur almost impossible to kill culturally, because every generation rebuilds Camelot differently. And perhaps the most important part of the legend is its ending. Arthur does not simply die in many traditions. He is carried away to the island of Avalon, wounded but not gone forever. One day, according to legend, he may return when Britain needs him most. That idea mattered enormously during difficult periods of history. The once and future king, not buried completely, not forgotten, merely waiting. Whether Arthur was real almost becomes irrelevant beside the emotional force of that promise, because legends survive when they express something people need to hear, and for centuries, people have desperately needed to believe that somewhere beyond the fog, a better age might still return. So, was King Arthur a real person? The honest answer is both frustrating and strangely beautiful. Probably. But not the Arthur most people imagine. There was almost certainly no shining king ruling a united Britain from a perfect stone Camelot, surrounded by armoured knights in polished plate armour. Much of that imagery came centuries later, created by medieval writers projecting their own world backward onto the ruins of post-Roman Britain. The real Britain of Arthur's era was harsher, smaller, and far more desperate. Yet that does not mean the legend was invented from nothing. Somewhere in the chaos after Rome abandoned Britain, real war leaders fought to defend their territories against Saxon expansion. Real battles were fought, real kingdoms collapsed. Real people watched their world changing violently around them. And among those leaders, there may indeed have been one especially successful commander whose memory survived longer than the others. Perhaps he won a decisive battle like Badon. Perhaps he united rival Britons temporarily. Perhaps stories of his victories spread through generations until they became impossible to separate from fantasy itself. That process happens constantly throughout history. Heroes grow larger over time because memory prefers meaning over precision. Facts fade, symbolism survives, and Arthur became the ultimate symbol, not just of Britain, but of humanity's obsession with lost golden ages. Camelot represents the dream that somewhere in the past there existed a better world, more honourable, more united, more just, before betrayal, greed, and human weakness ruined everything. That theme appears again and again across civilizations because people consistently look backward imagining that history once made more sense than it actually did. Spoiler, it usually did not. Even Arthur's tragic downfall gives the legend power. His kingdom collapses from internal betrayal, forbidden love, ambition, and division, rather than simple foreign conquest. The message feels timeless, because societies throughout history tend to destroy themselves with remarkable efficiency long before outsiders finish the job. And perhaps that is why Arthur continues to fascinate historians. Not because we can fully prove him, but because he stands directly on the border between history and myth, where real human suffering slowly transforms into legend. Behind the magical swords and heroic quests lies a genuine memory of a broken Britain struggling to survive after the fall of Rome. A dark age searching desperately for heroes. Maybe Arthur was one man. Maybe he was several. Or maybe he became something even more powerful than history ever intended. A story people refuse to let die. And sometimes that is the closest thing to immortality history can offer. When people imagine Viking raids, they usually picture screaming warriors crashing onto beaches with axes raised high, ready to burn monasteries and dramatically ruin somebody's Tuesday morning. What they rarely picture is food preparation. But before any Viking longship left Scandinavia, somebody had to think carefully about supplies. Raids could last weeks or even months. Ships crossed cold seas, travelled unfamiliar rivers, and carried crews packed tightly together with very little room for luxury. A hungry Viking was a dangerous problem, especially when trapped on a wooden boat surrounded by other equally hungry Vikings holding sharp objects. So food mattered enormously. The warriors of the Viking Age needed meals that were durable, portable, and capable of surviving miserable weather conditions, somewhere between Norway and deep personal regret near the English coast. Fresh food spoiled quickly aboard ships. There was no refrigeration, no neat storage systems, and definitely no cheerful sailor asking whether anyone wanted oat milk in their coffee. Viking raiders relied heavily on preserved foods that could survive damp air, rough travel, and long periods without cooking. One of the most important staples was dried fish, particularly stockfish, usually cod-dried hard by the cold northern air. This stuff lasted for months, and became so tough that eating it sometimes resembled a negotiation with lumber. Vikings often softened it with water or butter before chewing, though desperate sailors probably just attacked it directly out of spite. Salted meat was equally important. Beef, pork, lamb, or goat could be heavily salted or smoked to survive long journeys. The flavour was intense, the texture occasionally alarming, but it provided vital protein during raids. Viking ships smelled constantly of salt water, wet wool, sweat, tar, smoke, and preserved meat. Romantic movies rarely include this detail for some mysterious reason. Alongside meat came hardy foods like barley bread and flatbread. These breads were dense, dry, and designed to last rather than impress anyone culinary. Nobody aboard a Viking longship expected soft pastries. Survival food had one primary job: prevent you from collapsing while rowing through freezing rain toward an armed enemy settlement. Nuts also travelled well. Hazelnuts and walnuts provided quick energy and could survive long voyages without spoiling. Dried berries, apples, and wild herbs occasionally supplemented meals when available. Honey sometimes sweetened food or drink, though luxury ingredients were limited during active raids. And then, of course, there was ale, because if you were rowing across stormy seas toward violent combat, slightly fermented courage probably felt medically necessary. By the time the longships pushed away from shore, the Vikings carried not just weapons and ambition, but an entire floating pantry of survival food designed for one brutal purpose: keeping warriors alive long enough to become legends. Life aboard a Viking longship was deeply uncomfortable, even before anyone started shooting arrows at you. The ships were fast, flexible, and brilliantly designed for raiding coastlines and rivers. They were not designed for comfort. Vikings slept cramped together beneath wool cloaks, soaked constantly by sea spray and rain, while surrounded by damp wood, snoring warriors, and the powerful aroma of preserved fish slowly fermenting inside storage barrels. And through all of this, food remained painfully simple. One of the most common staples on Viking raids was hard bread made from barley or rye. This bread was intentionally dry and dense because moisture meant mould, and mould meant starvation several weeks later, while floating somewhere off the English coast, wondering if raiding monasteries had perhaps been an overly ambitious career choice. The bread often resembled thick, flat cakes rather than soft loaves. Some were baked extremely hard to survive long voyages. Modern people would probably describe them as historically interesting, right before quietly searching for butter and dental assistance. Still, the bread mattered enormously. Grain formed the foundation of many Viking diets, especially for ordinary warriors who could not afford constant meat. Barley was particularly important across Scandinavia, because it survived harsh northern climates better than many other crops. Viking farms depended heavily on it, and raiding crews carried large supplies whenever possible. Sometimes these breads were eaten plain. Other times they were dipped into broths or softened with water, ale, or animal fat. A warm pot of stew aboard ship could transform miserable weather into slightly less miserable weather, which in Viking standards practically counted as luxury hospitality. Porridge also played a major role. Simple grain porridges made from barley or oats were easy to prepare, and filling enough to keep rowers functioning during exhausting journeys. Archaeological finds suggest Vikings used iron cauldrons for cooking aboard ships or during camps on land. Meals were communal, practical, and designed entirely around survival rather than elegance. Nobody aboard a longship was discussing plating presentation. The physical demands of raiding made calories essential. Rowing for hours through rough northern seas burned enormous energy. Add cold weather, heavy equipment, and occasional combat, and Viking warriors needed constant fuel simply to keep functioning. And yet food shortages remained common. Storms delayed ships. Supplies spoiled. Raids failed. Hunting opportunities disappeared. A crew expecting easy plunder might instead end up wet, exhausted, hungry, and arguing over dried fish texture while stranded beside some miserable coastline. This harsh reality shaped Viking culture deeply. Raids were not endless heroic adventures. They were dangerous expeditions where survival depended as much on preparation and endurance as battle skill. Behind every famous Viking warrior stood sacks of barley, salted meat, and enough hard bread to survive another week at sea. History remembers the axes. The stomach usually made the real decisions. If there was one food Vikings absolutely trusted during raids, it was salted meat, because nothing says prepared for adventure quite like carrying chunks of aggressively preserved animal flesh across freezing oceans. For Viking crews, meat preservation was essential. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, especially aboard crowded ships exposed to moisture, changing temperatures, and the general chaos of long-distance raiding. Without reliable preservation methods, entire expeditions could collapse into starvation surprisingly fast. So the Vikings became extremely skilled at keeping food edible for long periods. Salt was one of the most valuable tools for this. Meat packed heavily in salt lost moisture, slowing bacterial growth and allowing it to survive long journeys. Pork was especially common, though beef, goat, lamb, and even horse meat occasionally appeared depending on local customs and available livestock. Smoking meat also helped enormously. Large smokehouses could preserve food for winter or travel, filling cuts of meat with a dense smoky flavour, while drying them enough to resist decay. Viking settlements across Scandinavia relied heavily on these techniques because northern winters were long, brutal, and deeply uninterested in human optimism. Raiders carried preserved meat in barrels, leather bags, or wrapped bundles aboard ship. Meals were often eaten cold, sliced with knives, or thrown into stews when fires could safely be lit on shore. Imagine chewing salted pork after rowing through icy rain for 10 hours while your boots slowly absorb half the North Sea. Suddenly, modern meal prep seems emotionally manageable. Fish preservation worked similarly. Dried herring and cod became vital sources of protein during voyages. Scandinavia's coastlines provided enormous quantities of fish, and Vikings learned quickly how to dry or salt catches for future use. Stockfish became especially famous because it could last almost indefinitely if kept dry enough. Of course, last indefinitely did not necessarily mean taste wonderful. Some preserved foods became so tough that sailors had to soak them before eating. Others developed flavours that modern humans would politely describe as challenging. Hunger, however, is history's greatest seasoning. After several freezing days at sea, even suspiciously leathery cod probably tasted magnificent. Interestingly, Viking diets were often healthier than many people assume. They consumed substantial protein, grains, fish, nuts, berries, and occasionally dairy products. Compared to later medieval peasants surviving on little besides bread and despair, Vikings actually ate reasonably well when supplies held steady. The real danger was unpredictability. A failed raid could trap crews far from home with dwindling supplies. Storms destroyed cargo. Enemy resistance delayed departures. Rivers became blocked. Suddenly, carefully rationed meat barrels determined whether warriors returned home alive or became unfortunate skeletons discovered centuries later by confused archaeologists, which adds an entirely different emotional layer to dried fish, because aboard a Viking raid, survival often depended less on heroic combat and more on whether someone remembered to properly salt the pork before departure. Despite their terrifying reputation, Viking raiders could not survive entirely on meat, ale, and aggressive confidence. They also needed quick energy. Rowing longships demanded enormous physical effort. Raiding parties marched across unfamiliar terrain carrying weapons, shields, armour and supplies. Cold weather drained strength rapidly. A Viking warrior without food became slower, weaker, and dramatically less enthusiastic about charging into battle screaming the names of Norse gods. So portable snacks mattered more than most people realise. Nuts were especially valuable. Hazelnuts grew widely across northern Europe and appeared frequently in Viking diets. Archaeologists have found large quantities of nutshells at Viking settlements, showing they were eaten regularly both at home and during travel. Walnuts, while less common in Scandinavia itself, sometimes arrived through trade networks stretching across Europe. Nuts offered several major advantages. They lasted a long time, survived damp conditions reasonably well, and provided concentrated energy through fats and protein. In other words, they were the Viking equivalent of carrying emergency fuel in your pocket, except with fewer marketing slogans and considerably more mud involved. Dried berries also played an important role. Wild berries such as bilberries, lingonberries and cloudberries could be gathered seasonally and preserved for later use. These added nutrients and flavour to otherwise repetitive meals dominated by grain and salted meat. Imagine weeks at sea eating dried fish and barley bread, then suddenly discovering a handful of berries. Morale probably increased instantly by at least 40%. Apples were another useful travel food. Small hardy apples could survive journeys reasonably well and were sometimes dried for storage. While Vikings did not have access to the massive polished supermarket apples people know today, fruit still provided important variety in a difficult diet, and variety mattered psychologically. Long raids were exhausting and monotonous. Days blurred together between rowing, navigating, camping, repairing ships, and trying not to drown in freezing water. Food became one of the few comforts available. Even small changes in flavour or texture could lift spirits significantly during miserable voyages. Honey occasionally sweetened meals or drinks as well. Since sugar did not exist in Northern Europe at the time, honey was incredibly valuable. It flavoured porridges, preserved foods, and helped produce mead, the famous fermented drink deeply associated with Viking culture. Though honestly, after weeks aboard a crowded ship full of damp warriors, almost any mildly alcoholic liquid probably started looking spiritually important. Foraging also supplemented diets whenever opportunities appeared. Raiders hunted wild animals, gathered herbs, caught fish, and collected edible plants during stops along rivers and coastlines. Viking expeditions relied heavily on adaptability. Crews constantly adjusted to changing conditions, food shortages, and unexpected delays. Because beneath all the legendary imagery, Viking raids were brutal survival operations. And sometimes the difference between returning home as a celebrated warrior or disappearing forever into some muddy foreign field came down to something surprisingly simple. Whether you still had enough nuts left in the bag, actually eating aboard a Viking longship was a miserable experience disguised as daily routine. The ships themselves were engineering masterpieces. Fast, flexible, shallow enough for rivers, and capable of crossing open seas, Viking longships allowed raiders to strike coastlines with terrifying speed, but comfort was never the priority. Space aboard ship was limited, constantly wet, and packed tightly with men, weapons, tools, supplies, and the collective smell of unwashed humanity drifting across the North Sea. Meals happened wherever space allowed. Sometimes warriors ate sitting beside rowing benches while waves slapped against the hull. Other times, they stopped ashore to cook more substantial meals over open fires. During rough weather, food preparation became extremely difficult. Trying to handle hot stew inside a rocking wooden ship in freezing wind probably ended with at least one sailor quietly reconsidering all his life choices. Most meals were painfully simple. Dried fish, salted meat, hard bread, porridge, nuts and ale formed the foundation of shipboard eating. There were no elegant courses, no polished dining rituals, and certainly no cheerful Viking chef emerging dramatically from below deck announcing today's seafood special. Instead, meals focused entirely on survival. The physical labour aboard ship demanded constant energy. Rowers worked for hours at a time through cold rain and rough seas. Sleep came poorly. Clothing stayed damp. Muscles ached constantly. Even simple tasks became exhausting under northern weather conditions that seemed personally offended by human existence. Warm food therefore became incredibly important whenever possible. Archaeological evidence suggests Vikings carried iron cauldrons for cooking stews and porridges during longer journeys. Fires were usually built on land, rather than aboard ship, for obvious reasons involving wood, tar, sails, and basic survival instincts. Camps along coastlines or rivers offered precious moments to rest, repair equipment, and prepare proper meals. These camp meals likely felt glorious after days at sea. A hot stew bubbling beside a fire, while cloaks dried nearby, probably transformed exhausted warriors into temporarily functional human beings again. Storytelling, drinking, and eating together strengthened group bonds as well. Viking crews depended heavily on loyalty and cooperation. Shared meals reinforced that connection. Of course, food aboard raids was not always legal by local standards. Raiding parties often stole livestock, grain, ale, cheese, and preserved foods from monasteries, villages, and farms they attacked. Medieval chroniclers described Vikings looting food stores alongside treasure because armies, even seaborne ones, always required supplies. Gold looked impressive. Bread prevented death. And yet, even with preparation, many voyages remained harsh ordeals. Storms spoiled supplies. Fires failed in wet weather. Fresh water ran low. Rats occasionally invaded storage. Men became sick. Food turned rotten. The romantic image of Viking raiders feasting endlessly beside roaring fires ignores one important truth. Many meals were eaten cold, wet, exhausted, and somewhere far from home beneath skies that looked deeply uninterested in mercy. One of the strangest realities of Viking raids was how quickly conditions could swing between abundance and misery. One week, a crew might be feasting inside a captured monastery with stolen ale, fresh bread, roasted livestock, and enough cheese wheels to emotionally overwhelm half the ship. The next week, the same men could be gnawing dried fish in freezing rain, while arguing over whether mould technically counted as seasoning. Viking expeditions lived constantly on this edge. Raiding was unpredictable by nature. Crews depended heavily on timing, weather, navigation, and luck. A successful attack brought food, wealth, and supplies. A failed raid could leave warriors stranded far from home with dwindling provisions, and several extremely angry locals suddenly motivated to defend their chickens. Because despite popular imagination, Vikings did not sail endlessly with infinite food reserves. Longships had limited storage capacity. Supplies had to be balanced carefully between food, weapons, trade goods, loot, and crew space. Every extra barrel added weight. Every journey risked spoilage. And northern seas had a remarkable ability to destroy planning with terrifying efficiency. Storms were especially dangerous. Heavy weather delayed voyages, damaged ships, soaked supplies, and made cooking nearly impossible. Salt water ruined grain stores if containers failed. Fires could not always be lit during constant rain. Men weakened quickly under cold conditions combined with hunger and exhaustion, and hungry men become unpredictable. Viking sagas and chronicles occasionally describe disputes over supplies, stolen food, or tensions within crews during difficult journeys. Discipline aboard ships mattered enormously because survival depended on cooperation. Nobody wanted to discover halfway through a storm that Bjorn the Large had secretly eaten half the communal walnuts during the night. Although statistically speaking, Bjorn the Large absolutely did. Successful raids temporarily solved many food problems. Captured livestock could be slaughtered, grain stores emptied, ale barrels seized. Coastal farms and monasteries often contained valuable supplies precisely because these places stored surplus food for winter survival. Raiders targeted wealth, but they also targeted calories. Some expeditions even overwintered abroad. Large Viking armies camping in England or Francia established semi-permanent camps where food gathering became critical. Hunting, fishing, trading, farming, and extortion all helped sustain these forces through harsh winters. At that point, Viking raids became less quick coastal attack and more aggressively uninvited long-term residency. Interestingly, archaeological evidence suggests Vikings were adaptable eaters. They consumed local foods wherever they travelled, integrating foreign ingredients into their diets when possible. Trade routes stretching from Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire exposed them to a wide range of culinary influences. Though admittedly, after months at sea, even mediocre stew from a rainy English village probably tasted like divine intervention, Because beneath the legendary image of fearless Norse warriors stood a very practical reality. Armies march on their stomachs, and Viking raids survived on barrels, bread, salt, and the desperate hope that the next coastline contained something edible. No discussion of Viking raid food would be complete without mentioning the liquids that helped make long voyages slightly more tolerable. And by slightly more tolerable, we mean emotionally survivable while trapped on a wet wooden ship with 30 exhausted men who have not bathed properly in weeks. Alcohol played an important role in Viking society. Ale was by far the most common drink across Scandinavia. Unlike modern strong beers, Viking ale was often weaker and safer to consume than questionable water supplies, especially during travel. Brewing formed part of everyday life, and large households produced enormous quantities for feasts, rituals, and long journeys. Before raids, ships frequently carried barrels of ale aboard, not because Vikings were permanently drunk caricatures swinging axes wildly at clouds, but because ale provided calories, hydration, and morale. Life at sea was cold, repetitive, and dangerous. A warm drink after rowing through freezing rain probably felt spiritually transformative. Mead also carried enormous cultural importance. Made from fermented honey, mead appeared regularly in Viking celebrations, poetry, and elite feasting. It was sweeter, more luxurious, and often associated with wealth or special occasions. Norse mythology itself described great halls overflowing with endless drink, which honestly suggests Vikings approached the afterlife with very clear priorities. Still, mead was not necessarily the everyday drink of ordinary raiders. Honey was valuable, and producing large amounts of mead required resources. Ale remained far more practical for daily use. During long expeditions, watered ale or weak beer likely became common because strong intoxication aboard a crowded ship surrounded by weapons and freezing water was not an ideal survival strategy most of the time. Of course, Viking feasting traditions could become enormous when circumstances allowed. Sagas describe victory celebrations involving drinking contests, storytelling songs, and boasting about heroic deeds. These gatherings reinforced loyalty between warriors and leaders. A successful raid was not merely about wealth. It was about status, reputation, and proving oneself before companions. And alcohol helped lubricate all of that beautifully, though not always wisely. One can safely assume that at least several Viking arguments began with phrases like, "I could definitely row better than you during that storm," shortly before escalating into deeply avoidable violence. Interestingly, drinking horns and decorated cups found in archaeological sites suggest that communal drinking rituals carried symbolic meaning as well. Sharing drink reinforced bonds within crews and households. Refusing hospitality or drink could even be considered insulting in some contexts. But aboard actual raids, practicality usually dominated. Alcohol supplies had limits. Water and food remained more important overall. Excessive drunkenness endangered entire crews. Romantic modern images of endlessly partying Vikings ignore the brutal reality that survival at sea demanded constant work and attention, because one badly timed mistake during a storm could send a warrior overboard forever. And the North Sea was famously unsympathetic to intoxicated optimism. Modern stories often portray Vikings as unstoppable machines of violence charging fearlessly across Europe, fueled entirely by rage and dramatic background music. Real Viking raiders were much more vulnerable, especially when hungry. Hunger shaped nearly every aspect of Viking expeditions. It influenced morale, discipline, decision-making, and survival itself. A well-fed crew could row farther, fight harder, and endure harsh weather more effectively. A starving crew became slower, weaker, irritable, and dangerously desperate, which describes most humans, honestly, though fewer modern office workers respond by raiding coastal monasteries. Long voyages created constant food anxiety. Even carefully prepared supplies eventually dwindled. Salted meat shrank. Bread hardened further into what can only legally be described as medieval building material. Ale barrels emptied. Fishing failed. Storms delayed travel. Suddenly, crews faced the terrifying possibility of running out entirely, and the northern seas offered very little mercy. Cold weather increased calorie demands enormously. Rowing for hours through rough water burned energy rapidly. Wet clothing drained body heat. Sleep deprivation weakened men further. Under such conditions, even strong warriors deteriorated quickly without proper food. This helps explain why Viking raids often targeted monasteries and coastal settlements first. These locations usually contained stored grain, livestock, preserved foods, ale and other supplies essential for survival. Raiders sought treasure, yes, but food mattered immediately. Gold could not keep you alive during a freezing storm somewhere off the coast of Northumbria. Bread could. Hunger also intensified brutality. A desperate crew trapped far from home with failing supplies became far more dangerous. Historical chronicles often describe Viking armies becoming increasingly aggressive during prolonged campaigns. Part of this came from military ambition, but part came from simple survival pressure. Men who believed starvation awaited them if raids failed fought with terrifying determination. Archaeological evidence even suggests some Viking camps experienced periods of severe scarcity. Animal bones found at certain sites show crews consumed whatever was available, including lower quality cuts of meat and emergency food sources during hard times. Romantic visions of endless feasting collapse quickly when historians start uncovering evidence of exhausted warriors boiling scraps beside muddy winter camps. And winter itself was brutal. Some Viking forces overwintered abroad in temporary settlements where maintaining food supplies became a daily struggle. Hunting, fishing, extortion, trade, and farming all became necessary. Entire campaigns could depend less on battlefield victories and more on whether enough grain survived until spring, which is perhaps the least glamorous but most historically accurate part of warfare. Logistics decides history constantly while receiving almost none of the songs. In the end, Viking raids were not sustained purely by courage or violence. They were sustained by calories, by barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, dried fish hanging in damp air, and men constantly calculating how long supplies would last before desperation arrived. Because beyond all the legends, hunger remained the enemy Vikings could never fully defeat. In the end, the foods Vikings carried on raids reveal something surprisingly human about them. Beneath the terrifying reputation, beneath the axes, burning monasteries, and dragon-headed ships, Viking raiders were still ordinary people, trying desperately not to starve while crossing some of the harshest waters in Europe. And most of their meals were deeply unglamorous. There were no endless cinematic feasts aboard longships, no permanent banquets under torchlight, while heroic warriors laughed triumphantly into the northern wind. Most Viking food during raids was practical, repetitive, preserved, and designed for survival above all else. Hard bread, salted meat, dried fish, nuts, porridge, food tough enough to survive storms, damp weather, long journeys, and the rough handling of exhausted men packed tightly inside wooden ships. Yet these simple foods powered one of the most feared expansions in medieval history. From Scandinavia, Viking crews travelled across England, Ireland, Francia, the Baltic, the rivers of Eastern Europe, and even as far as the Byzantine Empire and North America. Their ships carried warriors, traders, explorers, and settlers enormous distances across dangerous waters. And everywhere they went, barrels and sacks travelled beside the weapons, because survival always came first. The romantic image of Vikings sometimes hides how difficult these voyages truly were. Crews battled freezing temperatures, storms, hunger, disease, exhaustion, and constant uncertainty. A raid could bring wealth and glory. It could also end with shipwreck, starvation, or death in some unfamiliar muddy field several thousand kilometres from home. Many never returned. The foods they carried reflected this brutal reality perfectly. Viking raid meals were portable solutions to a deeply unforgiving world. Preservation techniques like salting, smoking, and drying allowed crews to survive journeys that otherwise would have been impossible. Without those methods, the Viking Age itself may have looked very different. No preserved fish, no long voyages, no raids, possibly no very angry Norsemen suddenly appearing outside your monastery before sunrise. And perhaps that is the strangest part of all. Entire chapters of European history depended partly on extremely durable cod.